Rain poured relentlessly over the glistening pavement outside Delacroix, the most exclusive restaurant in town. Emily stood there, trembling, her thin, worn-out sweater clinging to her pregnant belly. Drops of rainwater traced down her face, soaking her hair to her cheeks. A black luxury car purred to a stop in front of her. Inside, Daniel sat comfortably behind the wheel, dry and composed, adjusting the collar of his designer coat. His eyes locked on Emily for a brief moment, blank and unreadable. Then, with a slight press on the accelerator, he drove past, the car splashing water toward her without a second thought. Inside the grand glass walls of the restaurant, a valet nudged another, both chuckling under their breath as they watched the scene unfold. One of them muttered something, and the other smirked, shaking his head as if witnessing some inevitable fall from grace. Emily didn't react to their laughter. She pulled the sides of her soaked sweater tighter around her growing belly and whispered to herself, "It's okay. Just walk." Her voice was barely a sound, but it carried the weight of someone used to swallowing their pride in front of strangers. Behind the tall windows, Lily, a young waitress with tired eyes and a dish rag slung over her arm, caught sight of Emily. Her hand paused mid-wipe on a glass, her mouth parting slightly in silent horror. She pressed a hand against the window as if to reach out, but quickly recoiled when the restaurant manager walked past behind her. Lily stayed frozen for a second longer, her gaze following Emily's slow, drenched steps. A sudden burst of flashing lights lit up the street as a line of paparazzi descended on a different spectacle. Daniel's car had parked just ahead, and the polished millionaire was now stepping out, holding an umbrella over a tall, glamorous woman in a silk gown that shimmered under the camera flashes. Vanessa, laughing easily, wrapped her manicured hand around Daniel's arm, tilting her head just enough to give the photographers a perfect shot. Emily shuffled past them, trying to disappear into the crowd, but there was no mistaking her. The heavy rain made everything clear, not blurry. The wetness molded her clothes to her frame, and even with her head bowed, her face was too familiar to those who cared to look. Daniel didn't glance in her direction. Neither did Vanessa, at least not right away. A sharp whisper escaped Vanessa's lips, aimed at Daniel, just loud enough for those nearest to catch it. "Looks like your little charity case finally drowned." She tossed her head back with a silvery laugh, perfectly posed for the next set of flashes. Daniel's face didn't even twitch. He simply adjusted the cuff of his shirt and continued walking toward the gold-plated doors of the restaurant, while Vanessa preened at his side. Emily's sneakers, soaked through and squeaking with every step, carried her forward along the curb. She slipped slightly on the slick stone but caught herself before she could fall. Not a single person reached out to steady her. She moved on, her arms wrapped tighter around her belly, shoulders hunched against the curb. Inside the restaurant, guests seated near the windows exchanged amused glances. A woman in a sequined dress leaned toward her companion and muttered something that made him snort into his wine glass. The restaurant had always been Daniel's playground, and by extension once hers too, until quietly and without fanfare it wasn't. Lily watched it all, her heart twisting in her chest. She glanced around nervously before grabbing a clean towel from a service tray and slipping outside through the staff door. She pretended to check something by the entrance, but lingered just long enough to gently drape the towel over a bench Emily was about to pass. It was a small thing, a silent offering of dignity in a place that had just stripped it away. Emily paused when she noticed the dry towel. Her hand hovered over it for a second, then dropped. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she gave a small, tired smile in Lily's direction, barely a flicker of gratitude, but real enough to make Lily's throat tighten. Back at the entrance, Vanessa clutched Daniel's arm tighter as they ascended the marble stairs. Her voice, dripping with mock concern, floated back toward Emily. "Hope someone calls her a cab. Wouldn't want to see me ruining your big night, darling." Daniel's only response was a dismissive shake of his head as he handed his umbrella to the doorman and disappeared inside. Emily stood there a moment longer, raindrops racing down her face, indistinguishable from tears. Her legs finally carried her away from the laughter, the flashes, and the warmth she could no longer claim. Each step was heavy, but she moved forward anyway, her figure shrinking into the night as the golden lights of Delacroix blurred behind her. Inside, behind the thick, warm walls, Daniel ordered champagne. Vanessa leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, a sly smile curving across her face. Whatever cruel joke she whispered made Daniel chuckle under his breath, his back turned fully toward the rain-streaked glass. Neither of them spared a second, thought for the woman walking alone into the storm. Emily hesitated outside the restaurant doors, the heavy gold handles gleaming under the entrance lights. The rain had soaked through her sneakers, her jeans clinging uncomfortably to her legs. She needed a moment of warmth, a chance to gather herself before she could figure out the next steps. Clutching the thin sweater tighter around her, she stepped toward the doors, careful not to draw attention. But attention found her anyway. As she pushed open the door, the restaurant manager, a broad-shouldered man with a stiff black tie, intercepted her with a practiced, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped in front of her with a slight bow, his hand casually blocking her path. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Private party tonight. Guests only," he said smoothly, tilting his head as if addressing a confused child. Emily's voice caught for a second. "I just need to get dry for a minute," she said, her voice low but steady. She wasn't begging, just asking, just hoping for a small act of humanity. The manager's smile stiffened further. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," he said louder now, and nearby guests glanced over, their curious gazes quickly turning into smirks of recognition. Inside the boring, glittering dining hall, laughter swirled through the air like smoke. Several guests turned their heads, whispering behind their glasses. A woman in a crimson dress leaned into her husband, murmuring, "Isn't that Daniel?" She left the sentence hanging, the implication sharp and cruel. A few younger men chuckled, raising their brows as if watching some inevitable downfall unfold. Emily felt the heat of their stares, even through the damp chill clinging to her skin. Her hand tightened around the strap of her battered purse, her knuckles turning white. She started to step back, her dignity crumbling quietly, when a small movement caught her eye. Lily, the young waitress from earlier, slipped through the staff, Doctor carrying a fresh white towel folded neatly under her arm. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure no one important was watching, Lily made her way toward Emily. She didn't say anything, didn't dare, but as she passed by, she let the towel fall lightly into Emily's hands. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that silent exchange, something strong and raw passed between them. Not pity, but respect. Emily mouthed a soundless, "Thank you," blinking back the steam that had nothing to do with the rain. Before Emily could step away fully, a burst of loud laughter cut through the rain. Vanessa, her arm hooked through Daniel's as if she were a queen at court, stood surrounded by a circle of giggling friends. She twirled a champagne flute between her fingers and said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "You know, if the city keeps letting stray cats in, pretty soon we'll need animal control at the door." Her words floated through the air, like a slap, a meaning sharp, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The group roared with laughter. Some of the older guests looked away awkwardly, pretending not to hear, but most smiled, amused by the cruelty dressed up as wit. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply raised his glass higher, clinking it against Vanessa's in a silent toast. Emily's cheeks burned. She turned sharply, the towel clutched to her chest like a shield, and moved away from the doorway before she made an even bigger scene. But fate, unkind and eager, wasn't done with her yet. As she passed near a cluster of guests gathered by the cocktail bar, one of Daniel's old business partners, a portly man with a ruddy face and a booming laugh, slapped Daniel on the back and barked, You really dodged a bullet, huh? She looks like she's been through a hurricane. Daniel smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Some mistakes, he said lightly, are best left to drown themselves. His words floated over the soft jazz humming through the restaurant, landing on Emily's ears with brutal clarity. She didn't stop walking. She didn't turn around. If she did, if she let them see her break, they would win. Every step she took felt like walking through quicksand, but she kept going, moving through the laughter, the whispers, the pointed stares, until the heavy doors of the restaurant swung shut behind her, and the cold, wet air embraced her again. Outside, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but Emily barely noticed. She stood there for a moment, towel pressed tightly against her body, grounding herself. Across the street, the world moved on without her. Cars honking, headlights, slicing through the mist. Somewhere deep inside, something settled. A quiet resolve, a flicker of something that refused to die, no matter how hard the world tried to stomp it out. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa and Daniel posed for more photos, the picture of glamour and success. No one mentioned the woman standing outside. No one cared. But Lily, wiping down a table nearby, glanced toward the window again. Her reflection caught against the glass, her eyes finding the hunched figure barely visible in the dark. She swallowed, hard, and turned back to her work, the clean towel still clutched in her hands like a secret. Emily took a slow breath, feeling the damp coldness creep deeper into her bones. She had nothing left here. Not shelter, not pride, not even a familiar peace. But she still had one thing no one could see, no one could touch or mock away. And someday, somehow, she would find a way to turn it into something stronger. The rain clung to Emily like a second skin as she shuffled down the sidewalk, one arm around her belly, the other still gripping the towel Lily had slipped her. Every cab that passed was either full or splashed muddy water in her direction without slowing down. She lifted a trembling hand once, twice, but the yellow lights flickered past her like cool ghosts, vanishing into the mist. Her shoes squished with every step, water seeping between her toes, and the world around her blurred into a haze of cold and loneliness. She finally spotted a dingy diner tucked between a boarded-up bookstore and a shuttered boutique. The neon sign above it flickered weakly, but the sight of any light, any open door, was enough. She pushed inside, the door jingling against the cracked glass. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and fried onions. A few late-night regulars hunched over chipped mugs, barely sparing her hands. Emily moved toward a booth in the far corner, sinking down onto the cracked vinyl seat with a soft glow. She unwrapped the towel from around her, wiping at her soaked sweater and hands best she could. Then, carefully, she pulled a handful of napkins from the dispenser, dabbing them against her belly where the fabric clung tight. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the crook of her arm, and whispered so softly that even she barely heard it. "You're stronger than you think." The words weren't a vow, weren't a war cry. They were survival, breathed into the air like a prayer. Across the diner, the bell over the door jingled, again. Emily didn't lift her head, but a new presence slipped quietly into the booth across from her. Lily. Her uniform was still damp at the edges, her sneakers squeaking faintly as she settled into the seat without asking, without speaking. She didn't smile. She didn't pretend everything was normal. She just sat there, her hands folded around a chipped coffee cup she hadn't ordered, offering something Emily hadn't realized she needed until it was there. Silent company. Waitress sauntered over, dropping a laminated menu on the table with a thud. Emily shook her head gently, mouthing a soft, "Thank you," then lowered her gaze again. She had no money to spend here, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. The waitress moved on without pressing, and for a few minutes, the world inside the diner was nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the muted clatter of forks against plates. Emily's fingers played absently with the edge of a napkin, her mind half floating when Lily's head jerked up suddenly, her eyes narrowing. Emily followed her gaze toward the far end of the diner, where a woman in expensive boots and a drenched trench coat stood near the payphone. Jabbing a finger angrily, she hissed into the receiver. It took Emily a moment to recognize Vanessa, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her makeup smudged, her voice sharp and brittle even from across the room. "I told you, I can't cover for him anymore." Vanessa snapped into the receiver, turning slightly so her face was visible in the cracked mirror behind the counter. "If this gets out, they'll drag me down too. I'm not taking the fall for his mistakes. Not this time." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Her heel tapped a rapid, anxious beat against the floor. "No, you listen to me. If this leaks, it's not just the girl. It's the deals, the fake accounts, everything. He's finished." Emily stiffened, her hand frozen halfway to her belly. She watched as Vanessa paced in tight, angry circles by the phone, her reflection multiplying into broken shards across the mirror. Every word she spat out was another crack in the image Daniel had built so carefully. The powerful millionaire, the charming socialite, it was all smoke. And somewhere underneath the smoke, something ugly was burning. Lily shifted in her seat, pressing closer to the table as if to shrink from view. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup, knuckles pale. She darted a quick, nervous glance at Emily, her lips parting slightly like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Vanessa slammed the receiver down so hard the whole phone rattled against the wall. She muttered a curse under her breath, yanked her coat tighter, and stormed out into the night without noticing either of them. The door slammed behind her with a hollow clang. For a long moment, the diner settled back into its muted rhythm. Emily slowly exhaled, her breath shaking. She turned her head slightly toward Lily, who was still staring at the door, her face tight with something Emily couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or something heavier. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding. The pieces of something larger falling into place around them like puzzle pieces they hadn't even realized they were holding. Emily sat back against the booth, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her gaze never leaving Lily's troubled face. Somewhere deep in her bones, she knew whatever she had just witnessed was only the beginning. The rain had lessened to a miserable drizzle by the time Emily made it back to her apartment, her steps heavy and dragging. The building loomed in the darkness, a squat rectangle of peeling paint and sagging balconies, the faint glow of television screens flickering behind thin curtains. She climbed the crumbling steps, one hand on the rusted railing for support. As she reached her door, her heart sank. A bright orange notice fluttered on the wood, its corners curling from the damp. She tore it off with numb fingers. Notice of eviction. Final warning. No apology, no grace period, no mercy. Before she could even process the paper in her hands, the landlord, Mr. Evans, stormed out of the neighboring unit, a threadbare cardigan hanging off his shoulders and a scowl already carved into his face. "About time you showed up," he barked, voice echoing down the narrow hallway. A few neighbors cracked open their doors, peeking through the gaps like wary animals sniffing at danger. "You think you can just live here for free? What? You think that baby in your gut is a free pass?" He waved a quick, accusatory finger in her face, his words loud and sharp enough to make Emily flinch. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. There was nothing to say. Her hands, still trembling from the cold and exhaustion, gripped the eviction notice tighter. Mr. Evans wasn't finished. "You're 2 months behind. 2. You think charity's my business? Pay up or get out. I'm changing the locks in 72 hours, you hear me? Don't think crime's gonna change." "That," he sneered as he turned away, muttering something about freeloaders under his breath. The hallway buzzed with low whispers, and the click of doors shutting quietly. Emily stood alone, a pillar of humiliation with nothing left to shield herself. Her cheeks burned, but her spine stayed straight. No tears, not here, not for them. Slowly, carefully, she peeled the wet sweater from her shoulders and pushed open her apartment door, stepping into the dim, threadbare safety of her own walls. The apartment smelled faintly of mold and old books. She sank into the only chair that hadn't lost a leg and placed the eviction notice on the table beside her, smoothing it out with both palms. Her stomach shifted under her hand, a gentle nudge that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. She whispered something wordless into the stillness. A breath of comfort meant more for herself than for the tiny life growing inside her. A soft knock startled her. She opened the door to find Lily standing there, still in her work uniform, her jacket dripping with rain. Lily didn't speak. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled business card. She pressed it into Emily's hand with a quick, urgent motion. Emily glanced down. Charlotte Hayes, attorney at law, specializing in women's rights, tenant defense, family protection. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting Lily's. No words were exchanged, only a silent promise in Lily's expression. You're not alone in this. Emily closed the door carefully behind her, locking it with a soft click. She sat down again, turning the card over and over between her fingers. A dozen thoughts flickered through her mind. Calls she could make, pleas she could try, desperate, texts she could send to Daniel, begging for mercy or compromise. She stared at her battered phone sitting on the table, the screen cracked and dark. Slowly, she reached for it, but her hand stopped just before touching it. She pulled back. No more begging. No more waiting for crumbs of kindness that would never come. She slid the phone off the table and placed it into a drawer, shutting it away like a bad memory. If Daniel thought she would break herself apart trying to chase him, he had miscalculated. Instead, she dug into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, the one where she had quietly, stubbornly stored every receipt, every photo, every email he had once so carelessly sent. She laid them out on the table, one by one, building a map of his lies. Rent stubs left unpaid, promises broken, medical appointments missed because he was too busy. Tiny betrayals that had once seemed forgivable, in isolation but now stacked up into a mountain of proof. She began sorting them, her hands steady even though her heart pounded wildly in her chest. The night stretched long, the only sound the occasional drip from the leaky kitchen sink. Emily worked under the flickering ceiling light, piecing together a case she hadn't even realized she'd been building for months. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it, how far she could go. But she knew one thing. She would not go down quietly. Meanwhile, across town, the glittering parties and celebrations continued as if nothing had changed. Vanessa, ever the opportunist, had taken to social media, posting a cryptic photo of herself, standing in front of a mirror, a sly smirk playing on her lips. The caption read, "Truth doesn't stay buried forever. Soon everyone will know who the real monsters are." No tags, no names. But the message was loud and clear to those who knew how to read between the lines. Emily's phone buzzed quietly. In the drawer, a notification lighting up the cracked screen she had turned away from. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. Whatever storm was coming, it was already gathering speed. And this time, she would be ready. The scandal broke like a dam under pressure. It started with a single video. A shaky clip leaked anonymously to a small gossip blog known for salacious stories. Within hours, the footage had spread across every major news outlet, gathering momentum like a storm rolling across dry canyons. The world watched in growing horror as Daniel, the polished millionaire they had admired, sneered at a visibly pregnant Emily during a private party months ago. His voice was unmistakable, the cruelty in his tone cutting deeper than any headline could describe. "Dragging around that thing like a badge of honor. he had joked, waving a champagne glass toward her swelling belly while his friends laughed. Screens everywhere replayed the clip. News anchors wore masks of professional outrage. Morning shows featured panels discussing the shocking betrayal of basic human decency. Hashtags calling for boycotts of Daniel's company trended within the day. Stocks, once symbols of his untouchable success, nosedived in a matter of hours. Investors scrambled to distance themselves. Endorsements were pulled. Deals evaporated. In boardrooms where Daniel's name had once opened doors, it now slammed them shut. Emily watched it all unfold, not from some high tower of vengeance, but from the modest kitchen table where she had sorted evidence by hand under flickering lights. She sat quietly, stirring a cup of tea gone cold. The television muted as images of Daniel's downfall flashed again and again across the screen. She didn't cheer, she didn't cry, she simply breathed, steady and sure, as if her body finally understood it no longer needed to brace for another blow. While Daniel's carefully curated empire crumbled, Emily moved with quiet precision. She gathered the folder she had built, not out of bitterness but out of necessity, and walked into the lawyer's office Lily had led her to. The building was nothing glamorous, just a second-story walk-up with a creepy sign that read, Charlotte Hills, attorney-at-law in fading gold lettering. But inside, it smelled of strong coffee and determination. Charlotte greeted Emily with a frown, handshake, and sharper eyes that missed nothing. They didn't talk about the land. They talked about rights, about justice, about dignity. The lawsuits were filed within days. One for emotional distress, another for breach of financial support, agreements, and a third for wrongful eviction. Documents were served quietly but publicly, each new filing picked up by eager reporters hungry for fresh angles. Emily's name began to appear not alongside words like scandal or shame, but next to terms like strength and courage. The world, once so quick to laugh behind its manicured hands, now leaned forward in sympathy. Daniel, for his part, smiled. Footage of him trying to dodge reporters went viral. In one clip, he shoved a microphone away, muttering curses under his breath. In another, he tried to brush off questions with jokes that fell flat in the quick, judgmental air. Vanessa, the spark that had ignited the fire, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors swirled that she had fled the city, or maybe just changed sides when the winds turned cold. The consequences piled higher each day. Daniel's company stock lost nearly 40% of its value in a single week. Major partners canceled, contracts without waiting for explanations. The glossy, perfect image he had built through expensive dinners, staged charity events, and endless photo ops cracked wide open, revealing something rotten underneath. Through it all, Emily said nothing. Publicly, she didn't call press conferences. She didn't post cryptic messages online. She let the truth speak for itself. When reporters shouted questions at her outside the courthouse, she simply nodded politely and kept walking, her hand steady on her growing belly. It wasn't silence born of weakness. It was the silence of someone who understood that dignity often bears loudest when spoken softly. Then, one morning, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside her building. A producer from a major news network stepped out, clutching a nervous smile, and a folder filled with permission forms. They wanted to offer Emily a platform, a carefully framed, respectful interview. They didn't want dirt. They wanted her story, her truth. Emily stood in the doorway for a long moment, considering. She could almost see herself as they saw her, the betrayed woman, the tragic figure who had risen from humiliation to quiet triumph. But she wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a headline. She was a woman who had been left to drown in the rain and who had found her own way back to shore. She nodded once, crisp and sure. She would tell her story. Not for vengeance, not for pity, but because somewhere out there, another woman was standing alone in the rain, thinking she had no choices left. Emily wanted her to see otherwise. As the sedan pulled away, carrying her toward the television studio, Emily glanced at her reflection in the car window. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her sweater was clean, her shoes dry. Her face wasn't the face of someone seeking revenge, it was the face of someone who had survived. And this time, everyone would see it. The studio lights burned hot, washing everything in an unforgiving glare. Emily sat beneath them, composed and unshaken, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Across the room, Daniel fidgeted at the edge of the stage. A microphone clipped awkwardly to the lapel of a jacket that somehow hung heavier on him now. His skin looked sallow under the makeup, his hair styled too carefully, as if he thought appearances alone could smooth over everything that had come to light. The host, a polished woman with a soothing voice, turned toward the camera with a practiced smile. Tonight, we have with us two individuals whose story has captured the heart of the nation. Her voice blurred into the background for Emily, who kept her gaze steady, breathing slowly through her nose, feeling the weight of the moment, but refusing to let it crush her. When Daniel's turn came, he stepped into the spotlight reluctantly. His apology, if it could be called that, was clearly rehearsed, the words falling flat despite his desperate attempts to inject them with sincerity. I want to publicly apologize for my actions, for the pain I caused. His mouth twisted, around the phrases like they tasted sour. The audience watched silently. No one moved, no one clapped. The air around him was cold and brittle, a stark contrast to the heat of the stage lights. Emily listened without a flicker of emotion crossing her face. It wasn't for him. It was never for him. This apology was a formality, a line item on a long list of consequences that he now had to pay. When it was her turn, Emily stood without needing to gather herself. She stepped to the microphone with a grace that didn't demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. "I don't need his apology," she said, her voice steady, clear, and heartbreakingly human. "What I needed, what many women need, is a place to go when the people who were supposed to love and protect them turn away." There was a murmur from the audience, the kind that comes not from outrage, but from recognition, from understanding. Emily continued, her words simple, but cutting in their honesty. "Today, I'm proud to announce the creation of the New Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting abandoned mothers and children, funded entirely through the settlement received from Daniel's company." A ripple of applause started in the back of the room, growing stronger, genuine, unstoppable. Emily didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for herself, small and real, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Pride. Offstage, Daniel stood frozen, forced to watch as society embraced the woman he had tried to erase. In that moment, he wasn't a powerful millionaire. He was just another man stripped of his mask, exposed and unwanted. The cameras swung away from him, chasing the light Emily carried effortlessly now, leaving him blinking and forgotten in the shadows. Outside the studio, the night buzzed with reporters and paparazzi, a wall of flashes and shouted questions. Daniel, trying to escape the heat of humiliation, pushed through the crowd toward his car. That's when Vanessa appeared, dressed to kill, smiling a sharp smile, every inch the new celebrity she had carved out of his downfall. She sauntered up to him, a microphone shoved into her hand by an eager reporter. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. She leaned in close, flashing her most dazzling smile for the cameras, and said sweetly, "Thanks for the launch, Daniel. Couldn't have built my new career without you." Her laughter rang out across the parking lot, high and mocking, bouncing off the concrete like a slap. Daniel recoiled as the cameras caught every second of it, every grimace, every ounce of his failure on full display. Emily stepped out into the chaos a few minutes later, moving slowly but purposefully, unfazed by the blinding lights. At her side, Lily appeared like a quiet shadow, unfolding an umbrella and holding it steady above Emily's head. He didn't know. They walked together through the crowd, heads held high, untouched by the frenzy around them. As the reporters shouted questions and the flashes exploded around her, Emily kept her eyes forward, her steps firm. The rain had started again, soft and persistent, but under the small circle of protection Lily provided, it felt almost warm. It wasn't the kind of rain that drowned you anymore. It was the kind that washed everything clean. Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything she had lost, the safety, the respect, the home she thought she needed, had been replaced by something far greater. She had built something no storm could tear down. And for the first time in a long time, the world had finally learned how to see her. The sun bathed the small plaza in gold as a soft breeze stirred the white banner strung between the new brick buildings. Emily stood at the center of it all, a pair of silver scissors poised between her fingers, the bright blue ribbon stretched before her. Around her, a crowd had gathered, not the indifferent or cruel faces she had once seen, but a sea of supporters. Men and women holding flowers, young mothers bouncing toddlers on their hips, reporters balancing cameras on their shoulders. The laughter, the music, the air itself felt thick with something electric. Respect, pride, hope. Emily took a breath and snipped the ribbon cleanly. Cheers erupted, echoing against the polished glass of the newly christened New Hope Foundation. Center. She smiled, not for the cameras, but because the moment was real, earned. At her side, Lily clapped along with the others, her face flushed with excitement. She had never left Emily's side. Not in the rain, not in the storm, and certainly not now that the skies had finally cleared. People surged forward, asking for photos, offering congratulations, holding out pamphlets for her signature. Some of the faces in the crowd were painfully familiar. A woman who had once whispered behind a wine glass at Daniel's party now waited eagerly, smiling too brightly, her phone clutched like a ticket to redemption. Emily posed for the photos without resentment, without malice. She understood something. They didn't. Real power didn't come from being adored. It came from surviving without needing anyone's approval. A news van parked nearby, its broadcast playing silently in the mounted screen. Across the field, an entirely different scene unfolded. Daniel's once famous mansion, its gates hanging open, the foreclosure notice stapled to the iron. Paparazzi milled around the property, snapping pictures of workers carting out furniture, and art. The golden life he had worshipped so faithfully, now auctioned off to the highest bidder, piece by crumbling piece. Emily didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to see it to know it was real. Some victories didn't require witnesses. They simply existed. The doors to the center swung open, and a group of young women stepped through, their eyes wide, their hands clutching small folders filled with dreams and paperwork. Emily watched them with a fierce tenderness beaming in her chest. These were the women for whom she had fought, who would never again have to stand outside in the rain begging for dignity. They entered the building freely, laughter trailing behind them like a banner of defiance against every door that had ever been slammed in their faces. Somewhere deep inside the moment, a voice as steady and real as the ground beneath her feet whispered. They left her drowning in the storm. She built a shelter no storm could destroy. The applause grew louder as Emily stepped back to let the crowd flow into the building, the future unfolding before her eyes in small, beautiful pieces. She caught sight of Lily again, standing near the edge of the crowd, holding an umbrella though the sky was clear. It was a simple gesture, but it made Emily's throat tighten with gratitude. There would always be storms, but there would also always be people willing to hold umbrellas, to offer dry towels, to sit silently beside you when the world turned its back. Emily pressed her hand gently against her stomach, feeling the smallest kick in response. A reminder of life, of continuation, of everything still waiting just around the corner. A woman from the local newspaper approached with a recorder, asking if Emily had a final word she wanted to share for the article they were running. Emily thought for a moment, her unshakable, and said, "This isn't about revenge. It's about making sure no one ever feels abandoned again. That's the real win." The woman nodded, scribbling furiously into her notebook, but Emily had already turned away. Her attention pulled back to the steady stream of young women entering the center. Some clutched duffel bags, others just small purses, all of them carrying more invisible burdens than any luggage could hold. But they were here. They had found the door open. That was enough. As the celebration continued around her, Emily felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This was her life now, built not on promises broken by others, but on promises she had made to herself. She had been invisible once, forgotten, discarded. Now, she was a lighthouse for those still caught in the dark. If you believe in second, chances and true resilience, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful real stories like Emily's.